Welcome back to Told by the Fire, a weekly podcast of original stories of strange happenings and ghostly occurrences, told in the dark of the woods. Relax, take a load off. You should be fine, as long as you stay by the fire. What exactly are the things that truly make us human? Is it the societies we have built, our ability to love and hate, our curiosity? What if all of those things were taken away? What if all we had was survival itself? Could we still consider ourselves to be human beings? Our next story is from someone wading into these murky waters, giving us their opinion after they have personally witnessed the beast staring back from just below the surface. When everything died, or it comes through in the taste. Written by S. Obaz. I was asked to provide this testimony to give an account of what became of us during that time. I could get in a lot of trouble for telling you what I know, for recounting it here, but I think it's worth the risk. I'm guessing I'm sharing this for the future humanity. That is, if there's anything left to be called humanity. Hopefully we won't have lost that humanity in our push to survive. Or perhaps we've lost the battle altogether, and the human species no longer wanders upon this earth. Let me first say, there are things that some people are willing to do to survive that I am not. One, because I am unwilling to accept them, but more importantly, because I don't have to. I will always take meat farmed humanely to that hunted in the wild, or even the processed stuff from a factory. It's about the methods. If you want a good cut of meat, you must love it. You have to feed it well and make sure it's happy. That's why it tastes a lot better than the scrawny and desperate beasts found in the wild, or that factory garbage, pulverized and riddled with bones, teeth, and even sand. I'm not trying to be arrogant about what I put in my belly, but I do have a righteous pride in the work of feeding others. That's because I'm a farmer. Always have been. Since before things changed even. My family has always been in food production, going back to my great-grandfather, maybe even further if some of my father's stories were true. I guess you could say, I always took it for granted. We all did, really. We planted, watered, and the earth produced. Like that old saying goes, sometimes you don't know what you have until it's gone. I grew up in the United States back when we could still organize ourselves enough to maintain countries. My family had a large farm. I remember at that time we had vast, endless fields of crops we grew and sold to feed others. Now the thought of those parts of my life make me giddy. Just imagine, having so much food, you would sell it to people you didn't even know. The entire world was green with plants of every kind, trees, bushes, and grasses. It was filled with birds and dogs, snakes, and fish. It all came so fast, once it got started, I mean. Picture it like a snowball, rolling down a slope, picking up speed and volume as it went, building on its own inertia to become this terrible thing. It didn't take long for our governments and most of society to completely fall apart. That's how it happened, unbelievable as it may seem. I remember at the time, the big thing was how all the corn was dying. The people on the news started comparing it to the Dust Bowl, the way that the dead fields where the corn had been grown dried into a barren wasteland. The government responded, both promising farmer aid packages while also assuring us all that the food supply was not in jeopardy. The more discerning among us knew this to be a lie. We had grocery stores then. They served the same purpose as the markets now, but they held so much more. There were fruits and vegetables of every kind, Any cut of meat you could think of, pastries and jams as far as the eye could see. The shelves were overflowing with food. Every time I remember them, I get a smile. However, at this time, the grocery stores started to run out of things. I remember how strange it was to walk into a store and see empty shelves. This was something none of us were used to. They always had exactly what was needed before. Most stores prided themselves on this fact. Now they just didn't. I guess more or less naturally people hoarded things that were hard to find, which only added to the problem. Even at the first sign of trouble, we learned later that the governments prepped things in secret, deciding who would live and who would die, while the people generally ignored it, deciding instead to accept the vague assurances made to us by our elected officials. It was easier to choose to go on with our daily lives, paying bills, going to work, raising our children, while we all watched the world die before us. How could anyone possibly accept the fact that their entire existence, the existence of life on this planet, might be coming to an end? To me, it became a little sad. I thought of all those things that human beings had worked so hard to accomplish. The art we created, the discoveries made in science, mathematics, and medicine, and wondered if it was all suddenly pointless. Was all of this, all of civilization, a giant waste of time? A great pedestal upon which we had placed ourselves, one generation after the next advancing, clawing forward from the caves all the way to the stars. Was it all built on nothing more than dust that was now crumbling underneath our very feet? The long and short of it was, the world was dying, and there would be nothing that we could do about it. We could not even fathom at that time how much this would change us, as we became pulled forward by our bellies, our most primal instincts, instead of guided by our hearts and our minds. It's Maslow's hierarchy of needs, right? A person must be able to eat before they can think about doing practically anything else. After the corn, it progressed to some plants most of us had never heard of. Then there were the small insects suddenly no longer buzzing around us on a summer evening. Tiny living things that most of us wouldn't give a second thought to before were now clearly absent, their silence serving as the loudest testament to a world that would never be the same. As more and more time passed, it became painfully obvious that the plant and animal life on Earth was all going extinct. That somehow we had begun going down this path, and now that it had begun, there was no turning back. We all took to calling it the extinction, and later, just E. The scientists of the nations of the world desperately looked for answers. Every avenue was investigated. They looked for a virus, tilled and studied the soil. They sent balloons and drones into the atmosphere searching for a change in composition. Anything and everything was considered. The troubling lack of answers and their dire predictions were the final flames that set the world on fire with panic. As the situation became more serious, the world was ravaged by hunger and grew insane from it. Carnivorous animals especially got much more aggressive. Bears, coyotes, and wolves came into suburban neighborhoods and even cities preying on humans. I've always been interested in the sea and marine animals in general. During this time, I noticed there were a lot more shark bites and deaths from those bites being reported. I remember seeing pictures of people torn in half by a shark that had obviously taken more than an exploratory bite. Killer whales began attacking boats and beaching themselves in desperation, as they now hunted us in a way they had once hunted sea lions. A great number of people became more angry, more desperate, or depressed, and some, most horribly of all, more violent. There was just this feeling that we were all trapped, spinning round on our browning home. Those who clung to science or maintained hope in other ways seemed to become rarer as time went on, and more creatures were lost forever to extinction. People wondered the obvious question, when will our turn come? Most governments responded to this with a heavy hand, each to their own varying degree, depending on resources. I always say I'd rather live under a poor dictatorship than a rich one, which is why I live here and how I stand before you now, a foreigner to be sure. I think I will always remember the day martial law was declared in my home country. It was the day I couldn't find a pear in the grocery store anymore. Eventually, plant life of all kinds browned and died. It started to look like fall all the time, with the dead leaves strewn all over the ground. That is, until all the leaves were gone, and then we were thrust into a perpetual winter. Before long, the trees lost their branches and then started to fall over. I never realized how many trees there were until they began to just topple over violently or drop massive branches from the sky. Vast fires blazed across the earth. Huge walls of flame were sent sprawling hundreds of miles in every direction as the graveyard of dead vegetation became kindling. In the wake of these, the world became a desert, filled with dust storms roaming mercilessly at will, their heavy winds battering what little live vegetation remained. As the last of the edible vegetation disappeared from the grocery stores, people were forced to turn to meat for all of their sustenance. I remember there being a movement at the time, well, more of a suicide cult, of vegetarian followers who denied themselves meat. Luckily, many of our livestock animals survived for a lot longer than any of the dire predictions had postulated. But that only resigned them to a different fate. While they were plentiful at the beginning, this did not last for long. People went through them quickly, as we tend to do when something is finite, and we are all desperate to have our bite of the apple. That's funny, no? Anyway, I can remember the vultures, and how ravenous they became for the flesh of our dead. And there were just so many dead that the only option was the mass graves. Still, the sight of those vultures on a huge pile of the dead, ripping them apart, I don't think I'll ever forget that. And the number of carrion birds just grew since there was such a plentiful food supply. I mean, they were hungry just like everything else was hungry, right? They ate the dead. That was their food. It's just one of the disturbing memories I have of that time. But I guess we had the last laugh anyway, because many of us soon became experts in the art of luring and bagging a giant turkey vulture. As I said before, I don't eat things caught in the wild, but I always made sure to have the best turkey vulture for sale when it was still around. I had the best beef as well, of which I had always been both a peddler and connoisseur. It makes my mouth water just thinking about a nice juicy steak. When the cattle began to undergo the panic of what this meant, and their rapidly dwindling numbers led to private collections. There they stayed until death found them all as well, scaling the highest walls built to protect them, penetrating vast negative pressure fields where they were held. It was able to peek into the darkest corners and most remote places in its quest to find them. There was talk of lab meat, but that never seemed to go anywhere. I know myself that lab meat was being produced then. I have been told this by acquaintances, which I will not name here. But it was relegated to the ultra-rich and the powerful, many of them building their own labs. So instead, as more things succumbed to we just went down the line, from cows to chickens to dogs and mice. People ate what they could find, and any compunction not to do so was quickly quieted by a rumbling belly. By the point we were all running around catching mice and roaches, the last of the grains were dying as well. Sorghum and rice, that was the last plant life on the planet. Strangely enough, they had outlasted everything, even the trees and the grass. As the last of the grains died off, and when the mice became difficult to find, we turned to more unconventional means to feed ourselves. And in so doing, it was as if many of the things that made us human disappeared as well. It felt to a lot of people that we were now the only creatures left on the planet. In the moments of clarity that came in between our bouts with hunger, a person could not help but feel they had been trapped here, drafted as the unwilling last desperate witnesses to a dying world. A sense of malaise tinged every part of the desperation that had become our daily lives. A person eventually had to ask themselves, what am I fighting for? to be the last to die of hunger. As a result, the mores and values that had held us together for so long eroded away. Slow at first, but then more quickly as desperation truly set in. What had once been whispered about in the shadows became a real and viable way to survive within no time at all. We had lost ourselves quickly, forgot who we had been before, and became possessed by the more grotesque parts of our collective character in the face of this hunger. Soon enough, the world became a place of perpetrators and victims, where a certain class of humanity began to be seen as food, a way for some to nourish themselves off the flesh of others. They were the ones who were milked and butchered. They became property and a commodity to be sold to others. At the outset, this expressly illegal activity was carried out by the same people who had been human smugglers before E had come, only now they plied their trade for an even more carnal purpose. Originally, the meat was sold in dark corners, or with a wink and a quick handoff. I remember how strange it was the first time I saw soldiers placing posters that warned about the medical and legal problems with consuming human flesh. But in a really short period, these became the same soldiers who we would see in the black markets buying the meat for themselves. When I saw that, I knew it was just a matter of time. Sure enough, as I had thought, a little while after that, the flesh was sealed and packed away like ground beef had been when it had existed, and openly sold in the markets. I knew then that the government was turning a blind eye. Finally, the packages came with federal certifications and stamps as an act of capitulation to the brutal reality that gripped the world. Nations went to war for the ever-dwindling things that were left, barking and snarling at each other like dogs, until slowly coming to the conclusion that they had no soldiers to fight them. No one was interested in a war far away when hunger was here, and now it lived in your home and walked your streets. As nation-states inevitably eroded away, the worlds in which we lived became smaller and smaller as well, until one only considered themselves a member of their community or even small band, willing to fight and kill any outsider for their flesh. Eventually, the smugglers became powerful criminal organizations which operated with virtual impunity, and in a lot of cases even setting up their own fiefdoms, taking people from the streets in the middle of the day or waging war with one another for the privilege. It was an extremely dangerous time, but who was there to stop them? They promised and delivered food, and for that they were granted dominion over all existence. And to feed those appetites, they might drug people or buy them, or they might use their tales of a place where food still grew from the ground to lure them to their deaths. Either way, the victims would be butchered and brought back to a table. There was always the very real fear that you could be taken at any time during a moment of weakness, or trapped because of a stupid mistake. Our world had become one where people simply disappeared regularly. I remember my neighbor vanished one day when he went on a walk, devastating his family. Everyone on the block did their best to make the family feel better, but we all knew what happened to him. One day a man might have a child, and the next he didn't. No one questioned it. These were just the things that happened. So there it is. And this is where we find ourselves now, living squarely in a world where we fight to survive by feeding on the only thing left to eat, our own flesh. Some say we are slowly causing our own inevitable extinction, our own self-perpetuated E, if you will. But those arguments fade into the wind when faced with the alternative, starvation. Besides, what is the solution to that? We lived in a dead world. We are the only survivors now. The world may one day disappear, but today we still have the flesh to fill our bellies. As I said before, I pride myself on being a farmer, on filling those bellies. These days I'm solely a livestock farmer. I guess that goes without saying. Back before E, I farmed corn and soy and raised dairy cows mostly. But like a lot of people, I had to change in the face of what happened. Without anything left to farm and with all the cattle gone, I inevitably specialized in the only livestock left to make any money from, I'm a one-stop shop for the highest quality flesh. While others are just birthing meat and then slaughtering it, I believe in free-range meat. An older and more experienced meat. There's a certain taste that experience puts into flesh that can't be replicated. Yes, it's more expensive both for me and the consumer buying the cut, but it's definitely worth the time and price. I have to say I've done pretty well with this model. That's what it's all about. Nourishment. Sustaining our bodies. It's the most basic need. It comes before almost anything else. That's really what we must remember about the world now. The world of the past and the world of the future. It's always been about feeding ourselves. Before anything we must eat. I know that and have always sought to solve this problem. That's what made me who I am today. I am a purveyor of hunger's satiation. I make a good living doing it too because I produce a premium, ethically sourced, and delicious slice of flesh. I guess maybe that's why you wanted to talk to me and get my perspective. Let me end by saying this. I love the meat and respect the meat. Always have, always will. And that comes through in the taste. Well, that's everything, I guess. Feel free to stop by anytime. Thank you for joining us today. Please follow us if you dare. We will continue to create stories regularly and post them here. Until next time, when we gather here again to hear more tales told by the fire.